Many have heard the story of the Queen of Castile who tragically went mad, but as always, there was a lot more to it. The tragic story of Juana la Loca features a horrible father, husband, and son, and a young woman being locked up for more than 40 years. Juana of Aragon was born on November 6, 1479 in Toledo, a city in her mother's kingdom of Castile. Juana's parents were Fernando II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile and Leon, known as the Catholic monarchs. Isabella and Fernando had 5 children, and Juana was their 3rd child. She had an older sister, Isabel, and a younger brother, Juan. She also had 2 younger sisters, Maria and someone you may be familiar with, Catherine of Aragon. At the time of Juana's birth, Spain was not a unified kingdom. The Iberian Peninsula in 1479 was full of smaller kingdoms that were constantly fighting each other. There was Portugal, Aragon, which Juana's father ruled, Castile and Leon, which Juana's mother ruled, and Navarre. Juana's mother, Isabella, married her second cousin Fernando, the heir to the throne of Aragon, in a secret ceremony. With Fernando's help, Isabella was able to become Queen of Castile, and a few years later, Fernando became King of Aragon. The fact that Isabella and Fernando were married did not make Castile, Leon, and Aragon one unified state. They were ruled by a married couple, which meant that their kingdoms were friendly to each other, but they were still separate states ruled by different people. Fernando and Isabella didn't have multiple sons to leave Aragon to one and Castile to the other, so after Isabella's death, Juan, their only son, would become King of Castile, and after Fernando's death, Juan would become King of Aragon, finally unifying most of Spain. Since Juana was not a boy, and because she wasn't the eldest daughter of Isabella and Fernando, she was never expected to become Queen of Castile, let alone rule anything in her own right. Still, Queen Isabella made sure that all her children were educated well. Juana and her sisters learned history, law, philosophy, and math. They weren't expected to become queens in their own right, but they were expected to become good queen consorts. Juana had beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes and was an introvert who liked to read. She was very smart and learned many languages and was talented at many things. Queen Isabella was a very strong woman and all her daughters inherited the trait, especially Juana. Isabella and Juana were very alike, so they did not get along very well. Isabella was a very Catholic person. In fact, she and Fernando were the ones who started the Spanish Inquisition. Juana was not Catholic enough for her mother, so it is said that Isabella may have used torture on Juana. One form of torture that may have been used on the young princess would have been la cuerda, which meant that Juana would have been tied by her arms to something that she would hang from, and the weights would be tied to her legs. The point of this type of torture was for the person's arms and legs to fall off eventually, but thankfully this never happened to Juana. The theory that Isabella had tortured her daughter Juana is now being called into question, and it probably was not the truth. When Juana was 16, she was betrothed to the 18-year-old Philip, Duke of Burgundy, son of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and his wife, Mary of Burgundy. To learn more about them, watch my video on Mary. A marriage was also arranged for Juana's brother Juan and Philip's sister Margaret. Philip had inherited the title of Duke of Burgundy from his mother after her death, and would become Holy Roman Emperor once his father died. Philip was known as Philip the Handsome. The much more believable translation is Philip the Fair, referring to his pale skin rather than his handsomeness. Juana arrived in Flanders to marry her betrothed. It was love at first sight, and they did not want to wait until the day their marriage had been planned to be husband and wife. They ran off to consummate the marriage the moment they were married. It seemed like Juana would have a happy marriage, but that was not at all the case. Immediately, Philip proved to be the husband of Juana's nightmares. He was unfaithful to Juana and not exactly secretive about it. Philip's father, Maximilian, who had had a very close relationship with Philip's mother, Mary of Burgundy, tried to make Philip have a little more respect for his wife, but that did not work. Juana was not the type of person who would tolerate this and would get quite angry. She would sometimes even yell at Philip, and Philip would go and tell everyone that Juana was insane because of this. Philip paid enough attention to Juana to have 6 children with her. Their first daughter was Eleanor of Austria, who became the Queen of Portugal by marrying the same King of Portugal as her 2 aunts. Juana's 2 sisters had married. To learn more about those marriages, watch my video on Manuel the First Wives. Eleanor then married King Francis I of France. Philip was not pleased that Juana had given birth to a daughter, and apparently refused to give Juana enough money to support Eleanor and herself since she had not had a son. Allegedly, Philip also treated Juana like his prisoner. After Eleanor, Juana had a son Charles, later Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. After Charles, Juana had a second daughter Isabella, who became Queen of Denmark. Then, Juana had Ferdinand, another Holy Roman Emperor. Juana had 2 more daughters, Mary, Queen of Bohemia and Hungary, and Catherine, Queen of Portugal. As Juana gave birth to her 6 children, her siblings died. Her older sister Isabel died in childbirth, and her son quickly followed. Next, her older brother Juan died, but his wife was pregnant at the time of his death. Everyone waited anxiously for a healthy son, but instead, a stillborn daughter was born. Juana was left as the oldest remaining daughter of her parents, and so she became the heir to both the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. Immediately after Juana's brother's death, Philip began addressing himself as Prince of Asturias, the title of the heir to the throne, even though his wife was the actual heir. Juana had to leave Flanders to go back to Castile now that she was heir, and she was given the title Princess of Asturias in 1502. Juana's two older siblings had just died, and Philip was not exactly treating his wife well, so at the time, Juana was not doing very well mentally. Philip, being who he was, used that as an excuse to leave and come back to Juana constantly. He would leave whenever his wife was angry at him for being a horrible husband, and would come back once he'd given Juana some time to cool off. He kept doing that for a while, which understandably made Juana quite angry. Philip would go and tell everyone that Juana was insane just because she was angry and vocal about it. Juana and Philip continued to argue constantly, then Philip did another horrible thing. Juana's mother, Isabella, was on her deathbed, and Juana, who was pregnant with her fourth child, was so devastated that she stopped sleeping and eating. Philip left their 3 children and Juana in Castile and went back to Flanders. Juana, who had always been in love with Philip, wanted to follow him to Flanders, but her mother did not allow her to do so. Isabella and Fernando, Juana's parents, had never exactly liked Philip, and travel would be dangerous for the pregnant Juana, so they did not allow her to leave. Juana's mental state continued to deteriorate, with her husband away, her mother dying, and her being pregnant. Once she finally gave birth to her second son, Ferdinand, she once again begged her parents to leave, but they refused once again. Juana was not happy about this and threw herself onto the castle gates, half-dressed and screaming. She only stopped once she was too tired to continue. A year after her son's birth, Juana was finally allowed to go to Flanders, and she immediately started the long and dangerous journey. When she arrived, she immediately ran to go find Philip. She ended up finding Philip in bed with another lady. Juana, quite enraged, grabbed a pair of scissors and stabbed this woman in the face. Philip was not at all affected by this, so Juana had to resort to love potions, but it was a waste of Juana's money, since even the love potions didn't work on Philip. And then Juana's mother died. On top of the grief of her mother's death, Juana now had to go and become Queen of Castile. While Juana's mother was alive, Juana's father, Fernando, had a fair amount of power in Castile, but since his wife was no longer ruling the kingdom, that would no longer be the case. Philip was also unhappy. He would have wanted to rule alongside his wife, but instead, he was only allowed to be her consort. Luckily for Juana, her mother, Queen Isabella, had hated Philip, and in her will she had made sure that it would be very hard for Philip to gain any power in Castile. Even though Philip and his father-in-law, Fernando, weren't fond of each other, they were working towards the same goal, getting rid of Juana. If Juana was incapable of ruling, all the power in Castile would go to Philip, so he continued to do what he had been doing, and spread rumors of Juana's madness. Fernando decided to remarry to Germaine of Foix, a French noblewoman, with the hopes that she would bear a son to keep the throne out of Philip and Juana's hands. She was 18 and her new husband was 54. Juana and Philip decided to finally return to Castile to take their throne, but they got shipwrecked. The two ended up in England, where they visited Juana's sister, Catherine of Aragon, who had been married to King Henry VIII. It had been years since Juana had seen any of her siblings, so it was a wonderfully happy moment for her and Catherine, just before both their lives fell apart thanks to the men they had married. There, they found that she and Philip were much more popular than Germaine and Fernando, purely because Germaine was French. Fernando, seeing what was clear, surrendered power to his son-in-law, but not an ounce to his insane daughter. Thanks to all the horrid men in her life, Juana was powerless and under their thumb. Her life just couldn't get worse, but it did. Philip died in 1506, and Juana went completely mad, as she was called. She didn't want to leave Philip's corpse and allegedly treated it like a living human. She ate with him and slept next to him while refusing to allow him to be buried. Juana was also pregnant at the time Philip died and gave birth to a daughter, Catherine. When she finally consented to allow Philip's body to be buried, she insisted that the coffin should only travel at night so no woman would fall for his handsome corpse. Fernando, history's most insensitive father, played up the rumors of his daughter's madness. A plague soon came to Castile, around when Fernando decided to return to Castile. As soon as Fernando showed up, the plague died down, which the superstitious Castilians interpreted as God's favor for Fernando against Juana. Fernando tried to make his daughter sign over her power to him, and though she attempted to refuse, Fernando's efforts were fruitful. Juana was locked up in a convent for her madness and separated from her children, who were sent to be raised by her husband's sister. The only one of her 6 children who was left with her was her youngest daughter, Catherine. Catherine ended up being raised in the convent with her imprisoned mother. A few years later, Fernando died, and as he had no children with Germaine of Foix, Castile and Aragon were left to Juana. However, Juana did not finally get the chance to take on her birthright. Her son, Charles, traveled from Flanders to Spain to rule his mother's kingdoms for her, and left her locked up. A few years after Charles took over, there was a rebellion against him. As he'd been raised in Flanders, he was too much of a Habsburg for the Spanish people's liking, and they preferred his younger brother, Ferdinand, who had been raised in Spain. The brother's grandfather, Fernando, had also wanted to name Ferdinand his heir because of this. Juana was Queen of Castile in name only, but the name held weight, so the rebels went to ask her for her blessing. Charles too was trying to get his mother's support. For the first time in her life, Juana truly held a position of power. Her choice would seal both her and her son's fate, and it was indeed a hard decision. Juana waited a significant amount of time to choose who she would give her support to, but in the end, she chose to throw her weight behind her son against the rebels. And he was so grateful to her that he left her locked up in the convent. He also took her daughter, Catherine, who had been living with Juana the whole time, and had her married off to the King of Portugal, the son of the king her aunts and sister had married. After being isolated for so many years, Juana was in fact appearing to be insane, as the men in her life had always said. The nuns in the convent were supposed to take care of her, but she thought that they were trying to kill her and grew paranoid. After all the betrayals, perhaps that was a rational fear. We don't know exactly what sort of condition Juana would have had, but it only got worse and worse until Juana actually did appear to be very insane. After 46 years of being imprisoned, becoming just as insane as her horrible son, father, and husband had told the world that she was, Juana died on April 12, 1555 at the age of 75.